Welcome to Dialogue. Today we are undertaking a deep dive into one of the most culturally charged topics in modern relationships, non-monogamy.
That's right.
But we want to move past the glossy, aspirational version you see on social media and get straight into the demanding reality.
Right into the friction.
Exactly. The fundamental friction that happens when a thrilling, kind of liberating fantasy meets the cold, hard requirements of, well, human biology and emotional accounting.
It's so important to understand that a fantasy is built to be seductive. I mean, it operates like a movie trailer.
Totally. High energy, perfectly edited.
All the best parts. Intensely exciting. And, crucially, it's guaranteed to omit all the boring, difficult, and sometimes really painful logistical steps you need to actually execute it.
And when it comes to relationships, that fantasy promises this idea of emotional liberation.
Which is so appealing.
And that liberation, that idea of non-monogamy, it often sounds like an enlightened spiritual buffet. You know, a place with endless choices, where love is abundant and boundaries are fluid.
But the reality is that the emotional cost often hits you like a serious financial auditor just showing up at your door unannounced.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
And you suddenly realize you have these massive, unanticipated emotional debts you have to pay.
So that's why we're calling this deep dive non-monogamy, the fantasy that hits like a tax audit. Because that theoretical liberation so often results in this profound, sometimes debilitating emotional upheaval.
I mean, the material we're looking at is so clear and vivid about the real costs. It describes the reality of people finding themselves in intense distress.
It gets really specific.
It does. I'm talking about, crying in the shower at 2 in the morning, listening to Drake. Well, you're also Googling specific painful symptoms of anxiety.
That specific anxiety, that physical somatic symptom of deep distress, the sudden sharp pain in your chest or the inability to eat, the jumpiness,
Yes.
that is the actual tangible price that the social media ads just conveniently leave out.
They do.
So our mission today is to investigate precisely why this concept, which promises emotional abundance and freedom, so frequently results in an experience of emotional scarcity and really profound psychological conflict.
We need to dissect the biological and psychological conflicts that are inevitably triggered when we try to override our own deeply embedded human programming.
It's about separating the glossy marketing from the demanding emotional mechanics.
You really need to know what you're signing up for, because your inner primal self is about to be triggered in ways your external philosophical self just never saw coming.
A good place to start then. Let's prepare ourselves to understand the architecture of attachment.
Let's do it.
So let's start exactly there, with that initial pitch, the thing that gets people hooked in the first place.
The marketing.
If you spend any time at all engaging with relationship discussions online, you've seen it. You've been exposed to the modern advertisement for non-monogamy.
It's everywhere.
It is. And it's an incredibly pervasive and carefully curated brand image. The presentation is universally optimized to look and sound, well, superior.
It's the visual branding of emotional evolution, isn't it?
Yeah.
You typically see two people, and they're always attractive, often with a style that signals I'm unconventional.
Right. Maybe bathed in that soft golden hour light.
Yes, that. And they're delivering these sweeping philosophical statements. They are selling a lifestyle, not just a relationship structure.
And the language they use is so strategic. It's designed to position their choice as intellectually superior to anything traditional.
Absolutely. They make these grandiose claims that are meant to signal a higher, more evolved level of being.
Suggesting that anyone who's not pursuing this is simply, what, unevolved, or just stuck in some societal trap.
The core pitch is always centered on a rejection of limitation. They'll say, we're evolved. We don't believe in possession. We believe in freedom.
And that concept of freedom, the escape from perceived constraint, that has to be the single most powerful engine of the fantasy. It's an alluring narrative because, who doesn't want to be free?
Right. And then there's the big one, love is infinite.
Which on its own is a beautiful and expansive philosophical idea.
It is. But what some of the analysis suggests is that this idea is often used practically as a kind of smokescreen.
How so?
It becomes a way to intellectually justify avoiding the actual messy and very finite reality of human emotional energy and resource allocation.
Ah, I see. So if you claim love is infinite, you don't have to deal with the fact that your time isn't. or your
Okay.
attention or your emotional capacity to soothe and process and repair things with someone.
Exactly. And monogamy, by contrast, is consistently cast as the villain in this story. It's always oppressive, restrictive, old-fashioned.
Just a societal cage that superior beings must transcend.
Right.
But what happens when that grand philosophy slams into the tiny details of intimate human connection? This is where the contradiction really comes into play.
And that contradiction is so palpable. You have individuals making these profound, dispassionate statements about not believing in possession or enmeshment,
Right.
while simultaneously exhibiting behaviors that are the very definition of singular, deep coupling.
There's a specific, almost savage example of this that was mentioned.
Oh, yes. People who claim radical freedom but have matching tattoos and share a toothbrush.
Sharing a toothbrush, I mean, that is peak intimacy.
It's a microscopic, nonverbal commitment to shared resources, shared space, shared biology.
And matching tattoos are a literal, physical, painful declaration of permanent, exclusive codependence. How do you reconcile those deep, primal gestures of singular attachment with the philosophical rejection of possession?
You can't, really. And the irony just demonstrates that the core human impulse toward deep, singular coupling is incredibly resilient. It exists way down here, beneath the layer of intellectual philosophy.
So if you're sharing essential personal hygiene items and permanently marking yourselves, you're operating on a fundamental level of intimate attachment, that is. Well, it's totally removed from the dispassionate free love ideal you're professing.
It shows that people often confuse intellectual aspiration with their emotional and biological reality.
It's the profound difference between just declaring a philosophy on a social media feed and then, living out your deeply wired mammalian reality day to day.
And there's a pretty pointed analysis of the validity of those statements, suggesting that such claims about transcending structure often sound like they're coming from someone who maybe struggles with basic structural accountability in their life.
Right, like maybe someone who hasn't been consistently accountable for paying their rent on time or maintaining complex schedules for years.
There's a strong correlation suggested there. If a person actively avoids necessary structure in their professional or financial life, they'll likely avoid the rigorous emotional structure required for any relationship to thrive.
And they will certainly struggle when you introduce the chaos of multiple partners.
Absolutely. Relationship structures, even the most flexible, non-monogamous ones, are essentially formalized limitations. They create boundaries that allow for deeper, focused, emotional investment.
And yet people rush into the fantasy because that promise of freedom is intoxicating. I mean, who doesn't want to escape perceived constraint?
But the key insight is that the emotional laws of gravity are universal. You just cannot escape consequence simply because you have redefined the parameters of your relationship.
Consequences are inevitable.
And the freedom phase ends abruptly. The moment emotional complications, the real-world mechanics start to materialize, it's over. The fantasy doesn't send a polite calendar invite.
No, it introduces itself with zero subtlety. There's this wonderfully precise and humorous analogy for it.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
Consequences show up not like a quiet bill in the mail, but like a Walmart greeter.
Yes.
Standing right at the door of your relationship, waving with that slightly forced cheerfulness and just saying, "Hi, welcome to reality, enjoy your stay."
And that reality is often the slow, painful realization that while the idea of intellectual freedom was thrilling, you can't simply bypass the emotional costs. You can't escape the deep primal conflicts.
Which brings us to the foundational problem, human biology.
Exactly. When we approach non-monogamy, the conversation's so often framed entirely around social norms or philosophy. We treat the human brain as if it were a philosophical blank slate, just ready to be programmed with whatever societal structure we choose.
But science tells a profoundly different and far more complex story.
It really does.
We have to establish the core scientific truth right at the start. It is undeniable that humans are biologically capable of sexual variety. We evolved with a distinct capacity to seek new genetic partners and new sexual experiences. That part is true.
Yes, that capacity for variety is built in.
Yeah.
But, and this is the absolute crucial point that the research emphasizes, we are also profoundly and deeply emotionally wired for pair bonding and singular attachment.
So there's the conflict right there.
The tragedy of this entire system is that these two capacities, the desire for variety and the need for exclusive attachment, they exist simultaneously. It creates a permanent internal conflict that no amount of philosophical reading can resolve.
It's an internal civil war, and you can't just use intellectual willpower to silence the side that's rooted in millions of years of evolutionary survival.
You can't. And the neuroscience clearly maps out the chemical drivers of this inherent conflict.
Let's get into that.
Okay, so we need to look closely at two key neurochemicals that drive attachment and desire. The first is oxytocin.
The cuddle hormone.
That's the one. Oxytocin is the neurochemical responsible for creating attachment, bonding, and that sense of safety and trust. It's released during childbirth,
Yeah.
breastfeeding, intimate physical touch, deep emotional connection,
All the good stuff.
all the good stuff. It physically drives us toward proximity and connection with a specific individual, forming that warm, fuzzy blanket of a secure relationship.
So oxytocin creates the feeling of bonding. But once that bond is established, there has to be a mechanism to reinforce the priority and the exclusivity of that bond, right? Otherwise, we just bond deeply with everyone we meet.
Precisely. And that's where the second chemical, dopamine, enters the picture.
Ah, the reward chemical.
In this context, dopamine is the craving and reward mechanism that reinforces the singular nature of the pair bond. It creates a highly specific reward loop. It tells the brain, this particular person provides the oxytocin, the safety, the warmth, the connection, and I need more of that specific person.
So it takes the generalized feeling of connection and just locks it onto a primary provider.
That is how the pair bond transitions from a generalized emotional choice into a biologically reinforced, compelling necessity. Dopamine doesn't just make us seek novelty. It makes us desperately seek the source of our emotional security.
And to understand why this system is so robust and ancient, we have to look at the evolutionary context.
Yes. Human babies, compared to other mammals, are uniquely and ridiculously helpless. They require years of sustained, continuous care. They can't regulate their own temperature. They require continuous feeding.
And famously, they can't even hold their own heads up for a long time after birth.
It's true. This level of sustained helplessness requires a prolonged, dedicated two-parent investment to ensure survival. If the parents were constantly cycling partners, the stability required for that helpless offspring to survive infancy and early childhood would be dramatically compromised.
So pair bonding evolved specifically to keep two adults focused.
Exactly. That oxytocin-dopamine loop evolved specifically to ensure two adults remained dedicated, exclusive, and focused enough to see that extremely vulnerable offspring through to independence. We literally needed that reinforced exclusivity to survive and propagate the species.
Which means we are essentially, what's the analogy? Giant emotional kangaroos with attachment issues.
I love that one. We have this incredibly vulnerable, needy core that requires a protected, focused structure, the pouches etch, to feel safe and thrive. We are hardwired for security.
And yet, in the face of this profound evolutionary history and neurochemical reality, people, often the most intellectually inclined, will insist that they are the grand exception.
The rules of the nervous system don't apply to me.
It's the myth of being built different. It's the ultimate expression of the intellectual ego trying to override a 3 million-year-old biological operating system.
It's intellectualizing away a visceral, physiological response. Individuals will assert this self-declaration of being evolved or somehow above jealousy or simple attachment needs, but they remain bound by the same nervous system responses as everyone else.
And there's a really humbling and relatable counterpoint to this hubris.
It's the moment when the intellectual defense just collapses.
Yes.
You might insist, quite passionately, that you are entirely built different and have achieved emotional mastery.
Yes.
But you're the same person who cried when your ex liked a picture of a fitness model on social media.
That tiny, mundane, digital, like a seemingly insignificant action on a scrolling feed, it triggers the full ancient evolutionary jealousy response.
It does. That sudden spike of insecurity, that feeling of competition, that is your ancient mammalian brain screaming about a threat to resource diversion.
It proves the wiring is active, regardless of how many philosophical treatises you've consumed. You just cannot intellectualize away your limbic system.
You can't simply choose to stop the production of oxytocin or choose to break the dopamine reward loop just because you've read a book on polyamory. That biological reality, the fact that we are wired for singular attachment despite our capacity for sexual variety, is the core engine of friction.
And it's why the fantasy version of non-monogamy is almost always set up for failure. It ignores the fundamental infrastructure of human love and security.
That's a powerful point.
Yeah.
The infrastructure of human love. If you ignore the foundation, the entire structure becomes incredibly fragile.
Which brings us to the operational reality, the messy daily execution of this whole structure.
Right.
So let's contrast the Disneyland version of the non-monogamy fantasy with the challenging emotional reality. The Disneyland version is where everything is curated, managed, and harmonious.
Yes, it promises a world where you effortlessly manage multiple schedules, you experience mutual, synchronous pleasure.
And that tantric energy flows freely between all partners, looking like a perfectly scored Netflix documentary about enlightened spiritualists.
And crucially, your partners are always enlightened monks. They communicate boundaries with radical, flawless clarity, they never project their insecurity, and they consistently prioritize your emotional state perfectly without fail.
Which is a fantasy.
That fantasy rests upon the assumption of perfectly regulated emotional environments and perfectly mature partners, which, let's be honest, is an incredibly rare combination in the context of modern dating. We are dealing with humans who are often stressed, underslept, and fundamentally insecure.
So the reality, unfortunately, is dramatically less glamorous and far more taxing. It's what happens when the professional lighting is turned off and you're just left alone with your own nervous system.
The messy reality involves genuine emotional agony, crying on the toilet in a moment of overwhelmed solitude, trying desperately to pretend to your partner that you are completely fine.
Hiding your phone during a conversation because you're battling an intense internal struggle you refuse to admit.
And that struggle is physiological. You can often see the physical manifestations, like that telltale involuntary eye twitch or the way a person's jaw clenches. That tic is the nervous system's way of broadcasting, "We are in distress." Even when the mouth is delivering the socially acceptable, "It's totally okay, I swear."
And this is where the core issue of jealousy surfaces with brutal force.
Yes. In the fantasy framework, jealousy is almost always framed as a failing.
Right. It's a disease, a personality flaw, or an unhealed wound that you have to diligently meditate away before you're truly worthy of non-monogamy.
And that framing is so damaging because it makes people feel deeply ashamed of a basic ancient human response. The key insight we have to internalize, though, is that jealousy is not necessarily a moral flaw. It is a fundamental biological signal.
A signal from your internal evolutionary alarm system. It's your nervous system entering the conversation, reviewing the incoming data, the absence of the primary partner, the diversion of emotional resources, and reacting with immense immediate biological concern.
The internal script, which operates far faster than your philosophical prefrontal cortex, is primitive. It's just, "Oh, page H, wait a minute. Are we competing for essential resources now? Because if we are, I am prepared to fight for them." Activate survival mode.
And it instantly puts the body into a state of alert because the stability of the pair bond, historically, was directly linked to survival and security.
And that alert carries a significant physiological toll. We are not just talking about an abstract feeling of sadness. We're talking about a measurable physical response that depletes your system.
A spiking heart rate, often a total loss of appetite, that anxiety is literally in your stomach.
It is. And then there's the debilitating internal ego battle. You are simultaneously trying to maintain that cool, philosophical, enlightened posture on the outside.
While internally, your limbic system is just screaming at a molecular level about the threat of displacement.
Right. You are desperately trying to talk yourself out of the basic human feeling of possessiveness while mentally fixating on details like, why is he touching her hair? That specific gentle stroke is my hair-touching ritual. That's a boundary violation.
That fixation, that microanalysis of intimate details, is the nervous system desperately searching for evidence of a resource threat. And to fight that basic, biologically ingrained instinct requires an extraordinary sustained level of emotional regulation.
It's like trying to hold a 50-pound weight above your head indefinitely. Eventually, you will fatigue and you will drop it.
Because the ideology demands perfect communication to manage this friction, couples often institute these mandatory structured communication nights.
Ah, yes, the processing sessions.
They commit to processing, validating, and sharing every complex emotional nuance. But even these formalized efforts often descend into utter futility and emotional exhaustion.
They become an emotional treadmill. They fall into this circular, self-defeating dialogue where both partners are operating from a place of chronic anxiety. Usually goes something like this.
Are you okay, really?
Yes, I'm fine.
No, I can tell you're not.
Okay, you're right, I'm not.
I knew you weren't.
And the conversation ends not in resolution, but in this mutual, exhausted, non-committal agreement. I'm trying, though. Same.
That is the sound of emotional resource depletion. Everyone is intellectually trying to adhere to the philosophy, but the structure itself generates so much unavoidable emotional friction that the participants simply lack the capacity to process it all.
They're one emotional sneeze away from reverting to monogamy because the sustained emotional cost of maintaining the structure becomes exponentially higher than the intellectual reward. They are living in a chronic state of emotional hypervigilance.
That sustained effort, that chronic low-level anxiety and regulation leads directly into the deeper structural damage, the emotional hangover that the fantasy just never prepares you for.
You pay the tax, and then you have to deal with the debt.
Right.
The primary failure of the idealized social media presentation is that it markets non-monogamy as consequence-free. It's positioned as Lululemon spirituality with no side effects. All the empowerment, none of the pain.
But when you subject your deep attachment system to constant duress, especially that low-grade anxiety of resource competition, the consequences are profound. They manifest not just as temporary sadness, but as structural changes to your identity and your trust.
Let's break down the specific consequences identified, starting with the shattering of the self, which is called emotional fragmentation.
Emotional fragmentation, okay.
It occurs because the individual is forced to create fundamentally different and sometimes contradictory identities to accommodate the needs and expectations of different relationships. You cannot be the same version of yourself with every partner.
Because the agreements, the boundaries, the emotional investments are fundamentally different. You're forced to become a professional, emotional chameleon.
Exactly. You're one person, maybe the serious, ambitious, intellectual anchor with partner A. Then you have to shift entirely into another role, the spontaneous, playful, sexually adventurous person with partner B. This requires an immense, constant cognitive load to manage the differing expectations and emotional tones.
And the most telling sign of this fragmentation is the utter exhaustion that defines the true self, the version of you that emerges only when you're alone.
Yes, this third, unmanaged version of the self is the one who cries during Disney movies, completely depleted by the need to constantly perform and regulate these multiple, emotionally separate roles. That relentless effort leads to a significant loss of personal coherence and self-knowledge. You start to lose track of who you are when you aren't performing for a partner.
The second consequence is maybe the most insidious because it operates beneath the level of conscious communication.
Micro-abandonment.
Right. This is a key detail that speaks directly to the nervous system.
When a partner leaves to see someone else, even with full consent, detailed communication, and genuine emotional processing, the nervous system logs a quiet, persistent, tiny betrayal.
So the intellectual mind might say, I'm evolved, this is fine, I trust them.
But the deeper primal limbic system registers the withdrawal of the crucial resource, the primary attachment figure, and it registers a threat to stability.
And this is the profound concept of the trauma sandwich. One tiny betrayal is manageable.
But if you stack 40 of these low-grade emotional events, 40 times you feel that quiet pang of displacement, rejection, or fear of replacement, you end up building a complete trauma sandwich. It's the cumulative impact of dozens of low-grade emotional injuries that results in chronic stress and generalized anxiety.
It's the emotional equivalent of a repetitive strain injury.
That's a great way to put it. One poorly executed movement is harmless, but repeating that same low-grade stressor hundreds of times leads to long-term debilitating pain. The nervous system is designed for safety and predictability, and non-monogamy, by its very nature, introduces radical, repeated unpredictability regarding access to your primary resource.
These micro-abandonments keep the fight-or-flight system in a low, constant hum of activation.
Which is why people often report feeling inexplicably tired or perpetually anxious.
And this chronic low-grade anxiety fuels the comparison syndrome, which is utterly pervasive and highly destructive.
Oh, and it spirals. It immediately stops being about appreciating the diversity of relationships and spirals into obsessively ranking the viability of everyone involved.
You start comparing absolutely everything.
It certainly starts with the physical, looks, fitness, and sexual performance. But it quickly spirals into deep insecurity, comparing body count, comparing general energy levels, intellectual chemistry, who makes whom laugh harder.
And even, hilariously, comparing zodiac signs.
Yes. The ego is desperately searching for any proof, any metric, that it is still the superior, still the most chosen, still the most valuable partner.
But the entire goal of comparison is self-soothing, and it rarely achieves that. Instead, it just amplifies the insecurity by providing endless, ambiguous data points for you to ruminate on.
And the long-term cost is structural damage to core attachment mechanisms,
Hmm.
bonding disruption. The neurochemical pathways that once reinforced a singular, secure devotion become fragmented and unreliable.
So once that implicit primal agreement of exclusivity is removed, the deepest level of secure trust is often damaged beyond repair.
It's like fracturing the foundation of a house. You
Hmm.
can try to patch the walls, but the core stability is compromised.
Which leads directly to the fifth consequence: severe long-term trust issues that impact future relationship health.
Yes, there's a very common pattern where individuals eventually exit these non-monogamous structures after experiencing the full emotional tax audit with a profound sense of exhaustion and a simple, distilled, compelling desire.
They leave wanting one thing.
They return to singular investment. They want a partner who chooses them fully, unequivocally, and permanently. They want someone who chooses them exclusively, like a normal human.
The experience strips away the intellectual idealism and reveals the deep, primal desire for secure, dedicated investment. The trauma sandwich has pushed them back toward the fundamental human need for secure, singular attachment.
They realized that while freedom was the goal, security was the price, and they were ultimately unwilling to pay it.
This realization brings us squarely to the competence gap. There is this gargantuan mismatch between the cultural message, which sells non-monogamy as empowering and accessible to everyone, and the actual, almost impossibly high level of emotional and psychological competence required to make it function sustainably.
True ethical non-monogamy requires extreme emotional stability, a capacity for radical, near-flawless self-awareness and communication, and the ability to maintain incredibly rigid, consistently applied boundaries.
Especially when powerful physical attraction is involved.
It is a structure reserved for the emotionally elite.
And the brutal defining irony is that these three critical requirements, stability, radical communication, and rigid boundaries, are precisely the three things that are most notoriously absent in modern dating culture.
We are, broadly speaking, emotionally under-resourced and communication challenged.
It's a profound disconnect. If we look at the baseline of modern communication, it is alarmingly low. There's a cutting and highly relevant critique on this.
Yes. If most people in the dating pool cannot even text back consistently, if they struggle with asynchronous communication and basic schedule coordination, how can they possibly be expected to manage the exponential complexities?
You're essentially asking someone who struggles with basic text responsiveness and managing their own calendar to perform complex emotional choreography worthy of a neuroscience PhD.
The difference is immense. Managing one partner's mild irritation versus managing three partners' severe simultaneous existential anxiety.
Let's illustrate the difference between common dating frustration and the full emotional weight of this.
Yeah.
Consider the baseline disappointment. You're left on red by a new date. That generates a spike of annoyance, maybe some mild insecurity about whether they like you. It's irritating, but it's survivable.
Now contrast that with the emotional weight of your primary, deeply bonded residential partner saying to you, very kindly and with full honesty, "Hey babe, I'm going to be out late, so don't wait up. I'm going my other date tonight."
And then you have to listen to the lock click as they walk out the door, knowing they're going to replicate the intimacy you share with them with someone else.
That is a tectonic shift in emotional reality. One is minor, modern angst. The other is a direct, unavoidable threat to your established survival and security system. It triggers the alarm bells immediately, precisely because the pair bond is being physically, temporally, and emotionally compromised, even if it is consented to.
And this complexity is suitable for the emotionally competent elite, and yet it is marketed to the emotionally average person who's just seeking easy liberation.
This competence mismatch inevitably leads to the shattering moment, the point where the fantasy collapses under the weight of reality.
The awakening.
This is the specific moment when the intellectual philosophy dissolves and the biological reality just walks in. It is rarely triggered by a grand, dramatic argument. Instead, it's specific, highly sensory, and often initiated by a mundane, piercing detail.
It bypasses all the intellectual defenses entirely. It could be the way your partner looks at someone else, that micro-expression of adoration or desire that you recognize but realize was never meant for you. That split-second glance pierces the bubble.
Or it might be a message you accidentally glimpse on their phone. Not necessarily something sexual, but a depth of emotional connection or a shared inside joke that reveals a parallel reality you weren't fully integrated into. A world they share that is fundamentally exclusionary.
Or, and this is maybe the most difficult, it's recognizing the morning after glow. that physical, emotional radiance your partner is carrying, that specific, relaxed contentment generated by intimacy, and knowing that glow wasn't meant for you.
Or even just the sound of your partner saying someone else's name with a particular tone of affection that feels utterly exclusionary and deeply intimate.
These sensory details strike directly at the limbic system, bypassing the part of the brain that says, I am evolved. They trigger the fundamental, undeniable realization that this experience is causing profound, irreparable pain that no amount of philosophical framing can mitigate.
And that single shattering realization is often simple and absolute. I am not built for this. I cannot sustain this cost.
And that conclusion, though it's painful, is followed by the acknowledgement that is ultimately meant to be self-soothing.
Congratulations, you're human.
Exactly. You are not a failure of emotional evolution. You are simply a highly sophisticated animal wired for attachment and security. And attempting to operate outside those core parameters has resulted in unsustainable stress.
The cycle, which we see repeat over and over again after people undergo this emotional tax audit, is what is aptly termed everybody comes home eventually.
So individuals attempt the non-monogamy structure, experience the massive emotional cost, and inevitably return to a deep, compelling desire for exclusivity and security.
They come back with a powerful sense of having completed a painful, emotionally taxing experiment. They've experienced the high of the fantasy and the low of the consequences, and they conclude, I have lived, I have learned, I've processed trauma, I've cried in the shower, and I've journaled until my hand cramped.
Now please, just give me one person who likes me and only shares their emotional life with me.
This cycle forces us to critically challenge the social narrative that frames monogamy as inherently restrictive, old-fashioned, or boring. We need to reframe it not as a mere societal imposition or a constraint, but as an elegant structure designed for biological harmony and emotional efficiency.
So monogamy is fundamentally the delivery system for security and emotional stability.
It is in alignment with the reality of our attachment wiring, which over the long term is a far more successful and less depleting strategy than constantly fighting against our own neurochemistry based on a thrilling but ultimately unrealistic fantasy.
It provides the contained, focused emotional environment necessary for secure, deep bonding and growth. It reduces the immense cognitive load required for emotional regulation.
Allowing both partners to dedicate their emotional resources toward shared goals and mutual support, rather than constant internal surveillance and processing of external threats.
And when we examine the deep-seated human desires that drive this inevitable return to exclusivity, they are powerful and universal. We don't just want a partner.
We want a partner who chooses us fully.
Not mostly, not partially, but totally, making us their one and only dedicated recipient of that oxytocin dopamine loop.
We desire someone who bonds with us deeply, who commits to investing their limited, precious emotional energy exclusively in our shared future. We crave a structure where our partner doesn't simply disappear at 9 o'clock in the evening to hang out with a friend,
Leaving us alone to manage the acute micro-abandonment anxiety that inevitably flares up.
And at the core of this drive is the profound human need to feel irreplaceable. This is the crucial defining concept. We need to feel fundamentally chosen and secure enough that the possibility of being swapped out or diminished by a third party doesn't loom over our relationship.
And understanding this desire is key to moving past the shame that the fantasy often imposes. The need to feel irreplaceable is not a flaw of dependency or weakness, right?
It's a fundamental feature of being a human wired for intense, singular attachment. To label that desire as a fault is to deny basic human psychology and evolutionary reality.
The final insight on this topic is profoundly humbling. The reason monogamy works when it does is not because it's the easiest relationship structure.
It is absolutely not easy, but it works because it is strategically aligned with how humans are fundamentally built. It adheres to biological reality, not just philosophical aspiration.
It offers the highest probability of emotional safety.
And admitting that alignment, acknowledging that you are not, in fact, built different and that your nervous system craves security, requires a level of honesty, humility, and emotional maturity that is often far greater than the maturity required to simply try the fantasy.
The fantasy of total freedom is seductive.
But the full price of admission is often the sustained stability of your entire nervous system.
So, what is the ultimate takeaway from this deep dive? The conclusion is not that non-monogamy is inherently morally wrong or intrinsically flawed. It isn't.
Not at all. But it does come with steep, predictable, and rarely discussed consequences that most people simply lack the internal psychological resources to successfully manage over the long term.
The complexity of maintaining radical honesty while consistently processing the pain of resource competition and abandonment signals is just too much for the vast majority of people who are already struggling with the baseline demands of modern life.
The fantasy sells the upside. The reality always eventually delivers the unavoidable invoice.
And this leads us to the final provocative thought to leave you with, the distinction between what we think we want and what our emotional system actually craves.
Right.
Most people don't actually want multiple partners and the trauma sandwich that comes with them. What they truly want is one partner and multiple fantasies within that relationship.
That's it. They crave the excitement, the variety, and the freedom of expression, but nested securely within a framework of absolute commitment, safety, and exclusivity.
That path demands more creative emotional maturity within the existing structure. It asks you to bring the adventure and the desire for variety home rather than seeking fundamental security elsewhere.
Well said.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.